We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined this week by John Ferguson, who's the editor of the Sunday Mail, and Douglas Dickie of the Scottish Daily Express. So we're going to cover three stories this week: the Glasgow fire that ripped through an iconic building in the city centre, the assisted dying bill, where it's at, and of course the impact of events in the Middle East on the Holyrood election campaign. So let's start with the fire. What we know just now is that a blaze started at a vape shop in the city's Union Street on Sunday evening, spread rapidly, demolished a much-loved building adjacent to Glasgow Central Station. As you can imagine, people across Scotland, particularly Glaswegians, are very upset. But John, although it was an awful, awful thing, it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah, it could have been a lot worse, and I don't think anyone was seriously injured, which is obviously the most important thing. And I actually walked past the scene just 5 minutes ago coming into the office, and it is absolutely devastating. You know, the whole building still lying across the road. And I guess the thing that struck me was that while it is really tragic to lose a historic building like that, there's an opportunity for the city now potentially to do something really nice on that site. I think the truth is that part of Union Street has been pretty run down and grimy for a long time, and I think planning permission was granted for a new development across the road quite recently. There's now, if you look at that site, you could do, I think the priority's got to be that it can't sit in scaffolding for the next 10 years. They've got to get a good architect in to do something really nice with that site. Potentially it could open into the station on one side, and it's a great location in the centre of the city and the other. So let's hope that we see some really inventive, big thinking to build something there that improves the whole area.
And Doug, I mean, I was saying to John there, it could have been a lot worse. There was a period on Sunday evening where people were openly speculating, are we going to lose Glasgow Central Station with all the damage that would do to the Scottish economy?
Well, yeah, and of course the Central Station is still shut until next week. As someone who uses Central on a daily basis, I'm quite lucky that I'm on the low level, so I've been able to come in. I've passed by. I was actually in town on Sunday. I made a very quick getaway from Ibrox to walk back into town to catch my train home, and it was you could see the smoke, you could see the fire engines, but at that stage it didn't feel like it was anything major. It seemed at that point like an isolated fire in a vape shop. But I was also there on Monday when Network Rail and John Swinney had a kind of photo call or a meeting there at the scene, and it honestly felt like something like a disaster movie. Seeing the spray, the water, and there was people there. There was a wee bit of disaster tourism going on. There was people there taking photos and whatnot. But look, I think what this has done, John kind of touched on it there, is it's kind of shone a light on that part of the town. I mean, it's not so long ago Union Street was placed under some sort of curfew or some sort of, this kind of antisocial behaviour zone. It's not great, but I think rather than, I would much rather see these historic buildings saved. I know you would. I know you're not saying you're glad it went on fire, but I think to see it as a kind of opportunity at this stage, it still feels. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Iron Brew sign, walking down I always remember walking down from the cinema, the Odeon, when I was a wee boy, and you would see the Iron Brew sign, and the city felt so vibrant. And in many ways, the city doesn't feel vibrant anymore. And that part of the city, there are 9, I actually counted them last night, there are 9 other listed buildings on Union Street, including Egyptian halls, which you were kind of talking about there. It's, the architecture of Glasgow is so beautiful, and yet, let's be honest here, this isn't the first historical building in Glasgow.
I was going to say Glasgow School of Art. It's the latest horror blaze.
It's kind of tinderbox city. So yeah, there's an opportunity, but it just feels sad to see another iconic building come down And my only hope is they don't stick up some student flats on it because, let's be honest, that has been the tendency in the past for Glasgow City Council.
We'll have to wait for the investigations to run their course to find out definitively what happened, but we do know that the fire was caused in a vape shop. There's questions over whether it was on the Scottish Government's official register for vapes. And it is going to raise questions about the regulation of these types of establishments. So, I mean, most vapes use rechargeable lithium batteries, which are flammable. John, I mean, would you expect to see greater regulations introduced in this area?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting to see. I mean, before this, I was particularly au fait with all the detail of the regulation around these sort of shops, and it is quite interesting to see that despite the fact there's quite well documented dangers with batteries, you can't take these electric scooters on the train, all that sort of stuff. It's quite interesting that there isn't really any extra regulation around opening a vape shop. Is there any other kind of shop in a location like that? And it does look like, if it does transpire that this was an electrical fire caused by all of these batteries, then I think it would warrant some extra protection in place or extra regulation around that type of shop.
All right, let's move on. So, assisted dying, I think this is by far the biggest issue at Holyrood this week. Liam MacArthur, the Lib Dem MSP, has a bill in this area. The final vote is next week, but I think certainly at least 3 days of parliamentary business are going to be devoted to hundreds of amendments, probably going to be getting a fourth day on Friday, which it's not quite unprecedented, but let's just say MSPs are not happy to be going back on Friday. Just to summarise the bill, it would allow terminally ill Scots to seek help to die, with people needing to have 2 doctors to confirm both that they have a condition which would kill them and that they have the mental capacity to request an assisted death before being eligible for an assisted death. At stage 1, it passed. This was last year by 70 votes to 56. But there is a feeling at Holyrood that the momentum is very much with the no's in this debate. So you've had 3 people switch sides. I think it's Scottish Tory leader Russell Finlay and 2 nationalists, Colette Stevenson and Audrey Nicholl. All 3 of them are saying that they've pretty much got the same concern, which is coercion. Another MSP who voted for it last year, Colin Smith, is currently charged with sexual offences. So, doing a bit of journalist maths, if you take all of that into consideration, then the yeses are probably at, I think, 66, and the noes, I think, are at 59. But speaking to people in all the political parties, there are expected to be further defections, people switching sides to oppose the legislation in the final vote next week. So, John, I asked Liam MacArthur this at Holyrood on Tuesday. Do you think it's slipping away from the people who support this bill?
It does certainly feel like the momentum is with the no's. It's interesting. Also, Westminster, it seems like the legislation there is kind of getting caught up in the House of Lords. It's a really tricky question, isn't it? It's not something that you particularly comes down in party political lines. MSPs have to do a lot of reading, I think, on this and decide what way they're gonna vote. There clearly is some big concerns around things like coercion, and I don't know that Liam MacArthur at this point has really sufficiently answered some of those questions. I just wonder whether there's a feeling the thing that could swing more MSPs onto the no side is just the feeling like this was introduced very quickly, both here and at Westminster. It's gone through both parliaments at high speed, and there's a lot of concerns. And I just wonder whether this could turn into something a bit like for example, the gender recognition legislation, where everybody kind of thought that's nice. It seems like the right thing to do, but they're kind of ignoring all of these professionals, people with the medical profession, people that work in palliative care, or saying there's some concerns here that haven't been addressed, and you could be going down a path that you'll regret later.
How do you see it going, Doug, next week?
Yeah, I mean, I think I said on here before, I would not like to be an MSP making this call, because I kind of feel like, in theory, and you know, and at its base form, people should have a right to decide. If they're really sick, they should have a right to decide on the future of their own life. And yet, there are all these concerns that are coming forward. And I remember I think it was debated before, Paul, and you said it was one of the best debating days at Holyrood, was it?
Yeah, I think that was it May? Was it as far
Yeah.
back as May?
And it is one of those issues that it is nice to see people kind of speaking from their conscience for a change. And they're not. This doesn't seem to be a party political thing, and people are being left to their own devices with it, which we very rarely see at Holyrood. And yet it does feel like it's getting rushed through. We're having to batter it through in the next few days because Holyrood's about to finish, and I think that will be the temptation for many to say, look, this is too quick, but it's maybe something that can be revisited sometime in the future, perhaps when we can look at the safeguards more. I mean, William MacArthur, I think, deserves credit for bringing it forward. I think he certainly sparked a debate, and a good debate for a change at Holyrood.
Yeah, I'd rather they were debating this than Greyhound
Yeah,
racing.
absolutely. Aye, or any other manner of things that they managed to come up with. But I think the momentum is clearly now that there's just too many concerns, and we're dealing with people's lives here. There's just too many concerns, and I think it will get balked. But I think many will be doing it with an idea that the opportunity may come again, in the coming decade or so.
I mean, I think we all agree that the momentum is with the Noes, but I still think that Liam MacArthur has got a decent chance of getting it over the line. I mean, if you look at the amendment that was passed yesterday, that was very much tightening up and giving added protection. So it would mean that anyone who's terminally ill would be reasonably expected to die within 6 months in order to be eligible. Now, Liam MacArthur was sceptical initially of that amendment. I think he agreed to it, or he agreed with it on Tuesday. It was passed. It seems like, in terms of the amendments, they are going in one way, which is trying to beef up safeguards.
To feel like, I know this is how, this is the rules of the game, but something like this, I kind of feel like just trying to get it over the line isn't the way we should be looking at it. Just get
Well,
like, and I get that that's the rules of the game. That's the game we play in politics. It's about getting one more vote than your opponent. But I just kind of feel as something as important like this, it would be better if we had some sort of real consensus with it. And no matter what happens in the vote, there's not going to be that consensus. It's going
Feels
to
like
be
something you would rather see won by a large majority.
Yeah,
than
yeah.
No, I think it would be preferable if there was a clear majority either way. I mean, I do think that when it comes down to it, the overwhelming majority of MSPs are either strongly for it or strongly against it, and they will not change their minds compared to how they voted at stage one. You're probably looking at about 15 or so MSPs in the middle who were soft no's, soft
Soft
yeses, could go either way. And I think that's where Liam MacArthur's focus is on just now. People like Daniel Johnson, the Labour MSP, who I think voted for it at stage one, now clearly has concerns. I know there are a couple of Tories in that category as well. Russell Finlay still says he supports the general principles of assisted dying, but in terms of coercion and the specifics of this scheme, he's got his concerns. So it's going to come down to a relatively small number of MSPs, whether this passes or is rejected.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I was quite. I've interviewed a few doctors about this, and their concerns are very much, it seems, that the ones that these amendments are to do with. It's about what is the definition of terminally ill, and I mean, this is really important. doctor I spoke to seemed to think that it was just too broad at the moment, and also the concerns around coercion, and it does like that. It does seem like something that's quite hard um, to get over. You know, the idea that people, once you have this law, that there will just by the nature of its existence, you will have elderly people who will feel like they're a burden, like there's this other way that they could end things, perhaps pass on property, wealth to their children rather than being used up in their care home expenses. These are really terrible, things for people to feel pressured into considering. And so that I think that would be where my concerns certainly would lie. But perhaps these are things that you could get over if you've got really good amendments and something that's really tightly drafted.
I feel, though, that if your concern is coercion, which is a legitimate fear, it's hard to see how you could ever really get over that. How could you have a safeguard in place that really guards against coercion?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you've got so that maybe it does come back to this idea of what is terminally ill, and if terminal ill was such a broad term that it could include people who potentially could live for years rather than 6 months, and
Well, the obvious
potentially,
examples, the Lockerbie bomber. We
yeah,
were told he had 6 months to live, and then he
Lasted
lived.
forever.
Yeah,
yeah, like the tighter that definition is, the less opportunity there would be for it to make that much of a difference to someone's future if they felt that there was some kind of coercion, or if that coercion came from themselves.
I mean, one mistake I think that Liam MacArthur did make, and he kind of conceded it on Tuesday, is that one of the amendments in terms of the criminal offences sanctions on coercion was to reduce the summary offence from, I think, a maximum of 2 years to less than 2 years. I think it was 2 years, either 2 years or 18 months. And that was explained as just bringing the summary offence into line with that sort of category of offence. I feel like, given that coercion is one of the main concerns, you should have done that in an earlier stage. That should have been done at stage 2 rather than bringing forward an amendment which waters down the criminal sanction a few days before the final vote. Something like that might just prove to be quite pivotal for some people.
yeah, and I think the point you make is great about what is coercion. It's just impossible. It's such an impossible issue, but it's these are the kind of issues that the Parliament should be discussing. So in some ways, it's tough for them, but it's good to see that there is still talent there, and there's people in it for the right reasons. Because too often, I think at Holyrood we see that the really entrenched side of politics, that kind of tribal side of it. So to see this is, even though it's such a complex issue, it's been quite refreshing.
And to be fair to Liam MacArthur,
Yeah.
he has conducted himself
Yeah, absolutely,
very well.
100%. Yeah,
He's not quite, the umpire
no,
in cricket. I mean, he's got a firm view on it, but I think that he's steered this legislation through in a way where he's, if not trusted by both sides, certainly respected by both sides.
and he's brought it forward for the right reasons, and he wants to get it over the line for the right reasons. But I just feel the more and more I think about it, the more I think about the press releases we get about it, the statements we get sent about it. There's seems to be a lot more, from the no side, getting in touch with us. I know they had Tammy Gray Thompson up, last week to kind of talk about it, and there is that kind of momentum. And as you say, it's we're only talking about a few votes here. All it takes. So on the other hand, from William MacArthur's point of view, all it takes is maybe for him to convince a few on the other side, and it could yet still go his way. But I'm not convinced that this legislation would be dead healthy to go through on based on one vote, one or two votes. I think.
I think one of the interesting points I think in this debate is this idea that the public are, like you're always these stats thrown at you, like 89%, 90% of the public are in favour of this, and I think it's a very difficult thing to really gauge honestly what public opinion is on this. Like, it really depends which way you're to ask someone the
Yeah.
question. Like I think you say to most people, you think people should have control over having a dignified death, then they'll say yes. But it's such a nuanced debate that I don't think you can really take it as read that there's overwhelming
I
public
think,
support.
yeah, I think most people probably sit where Russell Finlay sits, and that broadly supportive, but when you get into the kind of nuts and bolts of it, you start to see the pitfalls and you start to
I,
see the
I
problems.
think there probably is quite sizable support for it on balance, but I think the problem with public opinion for Liam MacArthur is that the people who support it, I don't think necessarily are going to thank their politicians for voting for it when the election comes. But the people who are opposed to assisted dying may very well try and punish a local MSP who votes for it. So I think the people who are against it are probably more passionate
Yeah.
and more likely to take out their frustrations at the ballot box than supporters of assisted dying.
There's clearly most religious organisations are opposed, and they've been very vocal about that, and they're obviously pushing quite hard against the legislation. It has to be said that there is also a very well organised and well funded campaign from the other side, and so there is some questions over just where that money's been coming from. We've written a little bit about this. It does seem like there's sort of US private healthcare interests that are pushing this stuff. A couple of the other really interesting considerations as well, that there's this idea that Scottish Parliament doesn't actually have the devolved power to put in place the protections for doctors who, for whatever reason, don't want to play a part in this, who object on ethical grounds or whatever, and say, like, I don't want to do it, that actually the Scottish Government doesn't have the power over employment legislation to put those protections in place, despite the fact I think that at the moment those protections are in the bill. So yeah, it feels like it's things like these potentially that are going to mean that I think you might have MSPs who are sitting on the fence who just think, I think we better just leave this for some time down the line.
Well, I think ultimately it's going to come down to a couple of votes. So right now it's impossible to say how it's going to go. Clearly, the momentum is with the no's. But just to go back to that stage one vote, I think there was a 14 vote gap between yes and no. So if Liam MacArthur was to accept other amendments that strengthen the safeguards even further, it may pass.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating. It's must be one of the most important things that the Parliament's ever voted on. Certainly one of the things that will have the biggest consequence, and it literally is a life or death matter.
And yet it's been squeezed in at the end. I don't know. There just feels something. But at least we get to talk about greyhound racing.
Well, let's move on to a much lighter subject, the Middle East. We all watch the TV, we're following the coverage and the impact on the global economy of the US-Israel intervention in Iran. So we've got soaring oil prices and fears about the impact on domestic energy prices and inflation. Regardless of what your view is on what Trump and Netanyahu did, it does seem to be causing economic carnage for pretty much every country across the world.
Yeah, definitely. And like, I think that Keir Starmer's actually done the right thing on this, and I sense it could be a huge. I mean, it's terrible to reduce these things to party politics. If you think of the horror that people in these countries are experiencing at the moment, but I do think that Keir Starmer's done the right thing in trying to stand back from it, and I think that it's potentially a huge blunder on the part of Nigel Farage to be so wholeheartedly in support of allowing America to set our foreign policy, a war that I think is hugely unpopular. I mean, I think it would be unpopular even if it wasn't having the impact it is. in terms of people's lives, higher energy bills, potentially people are going to be paying more for mortgages, there's um, food shortages potentially, and for what it seems to be a war that none of the parties that started it have really got can actually at this point explain what the exit strategy is or what they've done it for. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary stuff.
What seems to have happened here is that the US have assassinated the so-called supreme leader of Iran. He's been replaced by his more hardline son, and his son is basically in a situation where his family, because I think it's maybe his wife and others as well as his father, been murdered by the US and Israel. I'm not convinced that that's really a recipe for him wanting to sit around the table and negotiate with the US. I think he's going to be wanting vengeance.
No, I mean, it's just impossible to see that they've said this is a regime change war, which the only thing that can mean is they're going to go in, boots on the ground. They're going to try and take over a country of 90 million people. It's not going to happen. So what's the alternative? That you have to think the likely end point will be they'll obliterate the place with missiles, and at some point Trump will claim a victory and walk away because real tanked the stock market and sent energy prices up. And I think the most interesting thing is he's completely U-turned on the whole point of Donald Trump, which was no foreign wars. He said during the election campaign in America, vote for Biden and he'll invade. He'll start a war with Iran, and it's quite astonishing, really, that he's now done that himself.
Once he stops, so he can claim 9 foreign wars that he stopped.
Yeah.
You don't feel, Doug, that Trump's approach here, it's more Bill Clinton than it is George Bush. Clinton was always about, bombing countries but not putting boots in the ground, whereas Bush was clearly about regime change.
I think the problem with this is, I doubt you'd get MD here is going to defend the Iranian regime.
No. Horrific.
But if you're going to, in some ways, if you're going to remove it, then you need to go the whole hog. If you're going to do it, you need to do it, and this isn't doing it because you've just said
his son's
just taken over. So it increasingly looks like this wasn't really about regime change. It's just flexing his muscles in the Middle East. It's almost like he's woke up one morning and thought, you know what, I'm going to bomb Iran.
I mean, I think the truth is that this is a war that Israel wanted more than.
Yeah.
I don't think that America wanted this war particularly. I think that they've been kind of forced into it.
Well, but if you're going to do it, you need to do it properly. But no, there is no appetite to do it properly. No one wants, I'm sure America doesn't want its troops to be bogged down in another, Middle East war. Iran itself would be a completely different proposition from Iraq as well. It's just, I can't imagine how we would bring about regime change even through military force. And ultimately, of course, this is all taking place against the backdrop of these elections coming up. And it's funny what John said about how Keir Starmer, you think he's done the right thing, he's done quite well. Who do you think is going to get the blame for their petrol prices going up? Who do you think is going to get the blame for the energy prices going up at the ballot box come May?
And that's the key issue. It's about prolonging and worsening the cost of living crisis. Yeah. Just at the point where Labour were starting to say, well, look, interest rates are coming down. We've got inflation under control. We're slowly turning the corner. Looks like energy bills might rocket again.
Yeah.
And, despite the fact that I think Keir Starmer's done the right thing in distancing the UK from the US on this one particular foreign policy move, it will be Keir Starmer gets the blame, Labour that gets the blame. It's probably in Starmer's interest to come up with a pretty comprehensive cost of living package in order to head off that criticism.
I mean, he's probably not distanced himself enough, has he? And what can you really? There's a limit to how much a government can do in the face of the global oil supplies being cut off. I don't think that there's really anything that you can do to mitigate that. The whole world suffers from this, apart from possibly Benjamin Netanyahu seems to want to destabilize this region as much as possible. He seems to be the only winner. Everyone else loses, and it's pretty incredible, really, that America have been led into it.
And like the point that you made, Doug, it's Trump's got such a short attention span. He never sees
Yeah,
anything through.
no.
You know, so it was Venezuela, then it was Greenland, now it's Iran. He just goes from country to country.
I think
Where
he
will
was
it be
even
next?
talking.
You know,
No, he's already been
is he
talking
just-
about invading Cuba while
Yeah.
this stuff's been
does he just
ongoing.
get the map out and a dart and then, go for it?
I think he's a guy who realizes he's got 3 years left and he's searching for a legacy. I mean, he does have a legacy, a terrible legacy, but he wants a sort of Reagan style foreign policy legacy, but he doesn't have the temperament to see anything through.
No, because he's, like you say, he's got the attention span of a goldfish, and I think, if he thinks this is going to define his era, then I don't think he's going to like what that definition is, unless he's prepared to see it through. You've got to see it through, but he won't. Next week it'll be somewhere else. Like you
Which
say,
seeing it through
Cuba.
is a disaster for
that
for
yeah.
Trump, but nobody in America seriously sees
yeah
Iran as even in the top 100 of their
things that they want
concerns.
dealt with.
They do not
They want energy
see,
prices
see
to come
Iran
down,
as
and
a
petrol prices. to come down.
so it's disaster for Trump.
But
always, I think.
this time next week he'll be on to something else, and that's obviously not really a way you can govern, especially an American president. But all the while, ultimately it's people at their petrol pump. There's already talk of people stocking up and panic buying, and it's amazing. A bomb drops in Tehran, and it might end up deciding the Scottish election. It's
Also, as well,
the butterfly wing effect.
Given the terrible relationship now between the Prime Minister and the presidency, whiskey tariffs getting lifted anytime soon.
I mean, I think we do also, like, where is our moral authority? Like, America looks like America bombed a school where 150 kids got killed. The human cost in Iran is absolutely devastating. The human cost in Lebanon is devastating. And actually, despite the fact there seems to be a bit of a blackout on information, it looks like also, Tel Aviv, ordinary Israelis are also under pretty significant bombing now as well. So it's the human cost of this stuff is horrific, and it does seem extraordinary that there's so little said. In the past there always seemed to at least be some kind of semblance of a reason given, or attempts to get a UN resolution, even if it wasn't successful. With this, it literally is just, this is what America and Israel are doing. If you're not with us, you're against us. You're the stuff with Trump belittling Keir Starmer on social media. I mean, how far do you go before you just say, look, this is unacceptable?
Of course,
Don't
it
care
could
if
change.
America voted for him. You need to, but you can't have someone like this at the helm of the biggest and most powerful economy and military in the world.
He could change his mind in Starmer next week, though, because we've seen
Yeah,
that before.
he probably will.
I think there's midterms in the US. Is it this year or is it next year?
It's this
Or is
year,
it midterm? So I think probably maybe the best thing that could happen there is that the Republicans actually win midterms, and they might be able to focus more on domestic issues. I think this is a worry. If he's hamstrung domestically, he continues to see the foreign, the global stage is his stage. Maybe if the path was open for him to bring in more domestic.
I think it would be better if the Democrats won in the midterms, because I think they control the purse strings then in terms of funds available for.
He is just he's an out of control ultra narcissist. It's incredibly dangerous to have someone like Donald Trump in the position that he's in. It's difficult. He's been democratically elected, but it's potentially devastating for that. I think we're probably more danger of a nuclear war today than we ever have been over the last 50, 60 years.
What a cheery thought, John.
We'll get through all the subjects, don't we? The Glasgow fire, the Middle East and assisted dying. Amazing. All right, okay. Thanks very much again to John and to Doug, and thanks also to the Daily Record video team who produced this episode. You can listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or watch the episode on the Daily Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single sport.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.